Good morning and good afternoon, everyone here in New York and the United States, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Turkey and Europe. My name is Holger Klein, and I'm the director of the Sarcopsabanja Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia University. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to today's Doctoral Fellows talk by Matthew Gillman, entitled Gemstones, Gossip and Research in the Early Modern Mediterranean. For this last event in our academic year's program, we are joined not only by my Columbia colleague, Professor Avinoam Shalem, who is the Riggio Professor of the Arts of Islam here at Columbia University and currently serves a term as Director of the American Academy in Rome, but we are also joined by Professor Deborah Howard, Professor Emerita of Architectural History in the Faculty of Architecture and the History of Art and Fellow of St. John's College at the University of Cambridge, who has kindly agreed to serve as a respondent and further comment on Matthew's talk. Before I hand the podium over to Professor Shalem to introduce Matthew and moderate today's event, let me just say a few words of thanks. First of all, thanks are due to Professor Howard for joining us today and taking on the role as a respondent. And I would also like to thank the Department of Art History and Archaeology for co-sponsoring today's event and the staff of the Sarcopsabanja Center, especially Sharon Kim, for her valuable work on the poster and behind the scenes to make this event possible. Thanks are also due to you, our audience today, for joining us. We will reserve about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the event for questions from our participants, from all of you. And at that point, you can raise your Zoom hand in the reactions tab to identify that you have a question. We will open the podium then, and Professor Shalem will moderate the discussion. So this is my introduction, and I hand the podium over to Avinoam Shalem. Avinoam, the podium is yours.
Yes, thank you, Holger, and good evening to all of you. I'm very pleased and happy to welcome you all to this Zoom event, and I'm very also happy to send you my greeting from Rome now. I'm going to start by introducing Matthew, and then we will hear him speaking about a chapter from his PhD. Matthew Gillman is a 7th-year PhD here at the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. And he's also the 2020-2021 Sarcopsabanja Dissertation Fellow. He is a specialist in the art of the Muslim world, mainly concentrating on the medieval period. And he came to us here to Columbia to join our team and to join me here, I think very quickly after I came to Columbia. I think it was 2014 when he arrived here at Columbia. He arrived from the studying Middle East, taking his BA at the University of Washington, and later on did his master's degree at the University of Chicago, also in Middle Eastern Studies. Now, much of Matthew's work concerns actually moments of ambivalence and ambiguity, and how we perceive the meaning of art. I would even say he's interested in the history, or the histories, I would say, of making meaning of the arts of Islam. So he's complicated for us not only the objects themselves, he's complicating for us the whole writing of the histories for this field of Islamic art. And for example, in 2018, he curated here at Columbia at the rare collection and at the rare book and manuscript collection at the library at Butler, an exhibition which was called In the School of Wisdom, Persian Bookbinding between 1575 and 1890. And in this exhibition, he was able to highlight to us the decorated binding of this books, not only as a static object, as we usually approach them, almost as a painting on, be it leather, be it mainly wood, but he was rather looking at the ephemerality of this book binding, which were changed and changed over centuries, and made out of them objects that are made to with the knowledge that they are disposable. So here it is. Matthew is like, you know, searching and writing against the mainstream, creating a kind of art history, not about art of remembering and for the eternal, but creating art in order to sometimes forget. And his talk today is going to give us a chapter from his PhD, which is Medieval Glass and the Aesthetics of Simulation, in which he is going to change, I hope, our mind about this media and present glass as the chameleon of all media in medieval time. An object, oh, sorry, a material that always wants to be something else. And he's going to speak about the complex relationship of glass with the whole idea of counterfeiting and the simulation. His lecture today is titled Gemstones, Gossip and Research. So to you, Matthew, please.
So thank you a lot, Avinoam, my dear Dr. Vatar. Hopefully I can live up to the hype of the title. Before beginning, I'd also like to thank, again, both Holger Klein and Sharon Kim for organizing this event, as well as Deborah Howard and Avinoam for kindly agreeing to participate as well. I would also like to acknowledge the Sarcopsabanja Center for its critical support of my research, first as a summer fellow in 2018, and again during the current academic year, without which this work simply wouldn't have come to completion. So since it's already summer for everyone and there's kind of no reason to dally, I'm just going to take a few seconds to hopefully share my screen. Voila, so hopefully now everyone is seeing a slideshow. So just for reference, I've timed this talk at exactly 25 minutes, which should leave enough time afterward, hopefully, for questions about anything I've left out or left ambiguous. So without any further ado. In 1696, a French aristocrat named Aubry de la Mottray, aged 18, felt a sudden boredom with his life in Paris. So, against the advice of all of his friends, he decided to decamp for Rome. After several weeks of being led around art collections and ruins and gardens by hired guides, who tended to satisfy a taste for the canonical, de la Mottray moved on to Venice. Decades later, in his memoirs, he would speak about visiting the Cathedral of San Marco in particular. One sees in the treasury, he wrote, a rich variety of goods rare and precious for their workmanship and material. Among such goods was a single piece of turquoise, adorned with a circle of gold, he writes, which surrounds its edges and is enriched with emeralds and rubies and pearls. This piece was also reproduced in de la Mottray's book with two plates, possibly engraved by young William Hogarth, providing a profile and bottom view of the vessel. Of these images, the author added, quote, Mr. Talman, having received permission to draw this vessel, had dedicated it to Cardinal Ottoboni in recognition of the favor obtained by recommendation of this cardinal to draw everything rare in this genre in the two treasuries of San Marco. If you were to read this whole passage quickly, you would assume reasonably, that the author was recounting his own visit to see this object, possibly made in the company of this second visitor. But this precise description was not exactly accurate. The draftsman whom he credits can be identified as John Talman, a British antiquarian who did not arrive in Venice until a few years into the next century. It is possible that the two men instead met when de la Mottray, having wandered around Italy and subsequently Ottoman lands, eventually found his way to London, shortly before Talman left for his own continental grand tour. Yet no drawing by Talman actually exists of this object. Instead, having also begun his own journey in Rome, he hired one Giuseppe Grisoni, an artist, to work on his behalf for various projects. Hence, what we do have are three gouaches of the San Marco turquoise by Grisoni, These are part of a larger suite of nearly 100 such drawings, today kept in Chicago and London, which depict precious stone vessels that were once held in various Italian collections. This was a period when gemstones, a term that I use capaciously to include agate and other such materials, were considered an important artistic medium right alongside painting. Hence, one of our questions becomes, who actually saw the piece? De la Motre's description is based partly on drawings which, although made under permission given to Tallman, were likely executed by Grisoni. The early modern history of this bowl depends heavily, as we will see, on hearsay and secondhand information, a condition in which this particular episode may be the most benign example. This object, the San Marco turquoise, has a complex history. First, it should be noted that today we know with certainty that it is in fact made from opaque turquoise glass, specifically lead glass, rather than being a true gemstone. Since 1930, when it was published by C.J. Lamb in the first monograph on Islamic glass, art historians have tendered a number of competing historical attributions spanning Egypt, Iraq, and Iran from the 9th to 11th centuries. As part of my dissertation, which considers the medieval history of counterfeit gemstones, I argue that it was actually made in Baghdad in association with a very specific event in the mid-9th century, but this origin would have long since been forgotten during the bowl's journey of at least 4 centuries before arriving in Venice, likely by way of Fustat and Constantinople, if not perhaps also Herat and Tabriz. According to art historians of the past 90 years, this object was originally produced as a fraudulent piece meant to be passed off as turquoise, and was only recognized as glass during the European Enlightenment. Yet, as I argue in a separate chapter, this piece was never produced as a fake. My project at large instead reveals how, in the history of gemlike glasses or counterfeit gemstones, artistic intent is neither sufficient nor necessary for later viewers to make their own assumptions about an object. Instead, these were entirely dependent on the social and discursive environment in which such works happened to be encountered. This talk today is based on a chapter in which I establish, hopefully, a historical inversion, how medieval knowledge about the bowl's material was forgotten by the early modern period. Then, once the material was re-identified as glass, how a new wave of writers attempted to bury this truth yet again. This bowl was never intended, I would say, to be anything other than glass, although a great many people have attempted to make it into a gemstone, whether a real one or a fake one. To understand this story, I need to rewind a few centuries. A small number of medieval inventories of San Marco's treasury exist, which attest to the early presence of precious objects. The first to make unambiguous reference to a turquoise bowl decorated with silver gilt is from 1325, mentioned amongst several objects kept in a large coffer on the altar. What is curious about this inventory is that its phrasing is not wholly credulous about the material. Turquoise could simply have been the color. The seemingly plain description of a turquoise bowl can be compared with a subsequent line item for, quote, a glass plate decorated with silver gilt, said to be of emerald, which we, the writer, do not believe, unquote. If this is not specific enough to make my point, the next available document from 1571 explicitly describes the piece as, quote, a bowl of turquoise color of a material which is not known, unquote. For anyone aware of Venetian industries, it is only appropriate that these inventories should have expressed doubts. The city's glass workshops at Murano had themselves begun producing opaque turquoise glass as early as the 14th century, and certainly no later than the end of the 15th century, as attested by some extant examples like those on the screen. By the time of the 1571 inventory, strongly colored glass had mostly fallen out of favor, fallen out of fashion in favor of colorless cristallo and innovative assembly techniques like reticelli. It nevertheless continued to be used in limited ways. We have, for example, turquoise canes incorporated into a German-style tankard, possibly made in London by specifically an emigrant Venetian, datable to no later than 1548 or 49, based on a silver maker's mark on the mount. Put another way, by the time of the inventory, not only was opaque turquoise glass being produced in Venice, but the skill was already known abroad. Indeed, a few years later, in 1581, the writer Michel de Montaigne visited Florence and commented on, for example, Francesco de' Medici's, quote, pleasure at counterfeiting Oriental stones. Hence, the ability to produce glass in a variety of gem-like colors was a known phenomenon at the time. Yet this late medieval ambivalence about the material was entirely usurped by a printed book in 1604, which initiated 3 centuries of scholastic misadventure. The text in question was a description of San Marco published by a canon of the church, Giovanni Stringa. Writing as an insider, he had unmediated access to the treasury and thereby established the baseline published account against which subsequent writers would rehearse their own details. Stringa wrote how, among other objects, quote, there is a bowl made of a single piece of turquoise, very beautiful, of which it is not known if there is another like it in the world, with Egyptian letters carved on its underside, unquote. We should note that the next available inventory of the cathedral treasury, made in 1732, no longer described the bowl as being of a material which is not known, but specifically as a turquoise gemstone. This suggests a change of view within the church itself, one which affected visitors like de la Motte, who may have been granted admittance under a watchful eye. But if the question emerges of why the bowl was suddenly assumed to be a gemstone rather than glass, we are left in a situation where material, which can be examined by the eye and hand, also gives way to the symbolism associated with the object. In 1697, the same year that de la Motte had made his way to Venice and claimed to have seen the treasury, another Frenchman also visited, this time a Benedictine monk by the name of Bernard de Montfaucon. Of his own visit, he wrote, we are let into the famous treasury and storeroom of San Marco, and in the presence of the procurator, the famous precious stones and rich furniture are brought out first. He then lists all of these: an emerald vessel, like other vessels made from a single stone, true chalcedony, agate, sardonyx, and another large one of turquoise, shaped like a bowl with the following letters inscribed. And then the transcription is given, which are not Egyptian, as they think, but Arabic, and ought to be read, as I imagine, Bar Elau, Opifex Deus, the work of God. Some Orientals approved my conjecture and think, like me, that only God could be the workman of so great a rarity. His insertion, not Egyptian, as they think, indicates his own aside from the official perspective first given by Stringa and apparently upheld by the procurator a century later. De Montfaucon was a relatively savvy viewer, familiar with several ancient languages, and is in fact today credited with founding the discipline of paleography, although sadly his Arabic was not particularly great. The Grisoni Talman drawing, published by de la Motte, was much more accurate. The inscription in fact reads Khorasan, a fact that was not recognized until the 20th century. We can briefly add that Khorasan, the northeastern Persian province, was in fact the only region of the world known to produce turquoise at the time, at least until the Spanish conquest of South America. The original meaning of this inscription back to 9th century viewers is another story entirely. Suffice it to say that for the early modern European viewer, Arabic characters authenticated it as having originated in Muslim lands, the source of turquoise. As to how it arrived in Venice, our gentleman traveler de la Motte spoke about the various theories for the goods to be found in San Marco, and I quote, one hears many histories of their acquisition. One says that they were taken with the city of Constantinople by the Venetians in the year 1200 and transported afterward with various spoliated riches to Venice. Another claims that a king of Persia presented them to the Republic. Others speak yet differently. Stringa in 1604 had said nothing about the exotic origin of the turquoise bowl. He simply noted that it existed. He does, however, sometimes list other objects in association with their donors, particularly a handful of items that came from the Grimani family, who were a series of prominent Venetians, one of whom had become a doge. Among donated objects, Stringa says, quote, one sees a horiolo of precious gems given to the Republic by Uzun Hasan, king of Persia, unquote. This word, horiolo, should mean a clock, although I'm not aware of any such object matching this description as either being documented in previous centuries or as surviving today in the treasury. This description invites speculation. Perhaps he didn't intend a mechanical clock, but rather another type of device. One might be led to believe that this could be an hourglass, or alternatively, it could have been a clepsydra or water clock, which is to say an object that could be built as simply as a bowl. This could potentially lead us down a whole tangent involving hourglasses, which due to time I have to skip right over, sadly. Meanwhile, very little is known directly about Uzun Hasan's treasury. It's something that even a historian as indefatigable as John Woods, who's written about the Aq Qoyunlu, does not really address. What we can say, however, is that a certain Muhammad bin Mansur dedicated a book of gemstones to both Uzun Hasan and his heir apparent, Sultan Halil. This exists in a number of mostly undated copies, which have been studied by others, but the earliest one, unpublished since the 19th century, is kept in Oxford and dated November 1472. That is, it was produced precisely during the period in which Uzun Hasan was in negotiation with the Venetians for military assistance against the Ottomans. Earlier mineralogical treatises, such as those in Arabic by Al-Kindi in the 9th century or Al-Biruni in the 11th, had considered glass in their works to be a type of gemstone. During the 13th century, this was dropped in most authors' classification schemes. Curiously, this doesn't seem to correspond to any particular change in perception about the material, but simply to the period of Mongol conquests, during which time the glass industry in Central and West Asia was heavily decimated. Ibn Mansur's book likewise excludes glass, although there is a lengthy passage devoted to turquoise. Yet, meanwhile, attentive listeners might point out that we are actually on a false errand. A turquoise vessel was already documented in the treasury as of 1325. If this was indeed the bowl as we know it today, it would mean that it was not, in fact, a gift from Uzun Hasan. All I can add is that there are things that we know Uzun Hasan gave to Venice, for example, 2 pieces of narwhal ivory, documented in a contemporary album. But whether he also gave a bowl of turquoise, or a gem-studded clock, or if such objects simply came to be reassociated with his memory at a later moment, this is something that can only be resolved through more archival work, which, as we all know, is not possible for the moment. In the meantime, every piece of early modern gossip about the bowl could lead us to an interesting, overlooked topic, but like taking a wrong turn in Venice, we simply run into a series of scenic dead ends. Hence, what we are left with is hearsay. While early modern antiquarians believed the San Marco turquoise to be a true mineral, the art historian Leopoldo Cicognara attempted to set the record straight in 1820. His description occupies 2 different passages, which has unfortunately led to his position being misquoted by subsequent authors. First, in his own ekphrastic walkthrough of the treasury, he arrives at the bowl until now believed to be of turquoise stone. Then he lets himself get carried away on a tangent. The size of this immense stone, if we consider its preciousness, is greater than what one may ever see. One may note the 6 colonnettes which are mentioned at the Basilica of Cordoba, formerly a mosque, already built by the Saracens residing in Spain, who furnished it with many lamps and untold riches. These colonnettes are recognized as having the diameter of this bowl, which might make one believe that they came from the same mine, possibly Persian. And we do not know, meanwhile, of work of such nature made by the hands of Arabs, which more than anything else make one doubt that there are 2 types of turquoise, one mineral, believed to be this, the other fossil, and the second, according to naturalists, which is not found except in small fragments. In any case, it remains for scholars to debate the subject with the necessity of admitting the 2 species. This account is partially confused since, to my knowledge, no such turquoise colonnettes are to be found in the Mosque of Cordoba. In fact, I've been unable to locate any such reference to this feature in architectural literature. It may instead represent a corruption of a passing comment by Alexandre de Laborde, a Napoleonic diplomat in Madrid, who had once published a description of the Cordoba Mosque's arcades as including some columns made, quote, of a jasper that imitates turquoise, unquote. One might note that this was further mangled in another source, Guglielmo Berche, who instead spoke about turquoise columns to be found at a mosque in Seville. Cicognara's subsequent reference to 2 distinct types of turquoise mentioned by naturalists likewise appears to synthesize diverse sources. One is actually the 13th century Arabic writer Al-Tifashi, whose treatise on mineralogy happened to be translated into Italian in 1818, just as Cicognara was writing his book, or writing his report. Another may have been traders active in Iran who spoke about old rock whose export was blocked by the Safavid court, and new rock, a lesser quality stone that was exported in extremely controlled quantities, in a distinction which was first described, as it happens, by Ibn Mansur in his work for Uzun Hasan. But this tangent is ultimately a bit of a moot point. Chicognara was not, as many people seem to believe, writing about the treasury out of an antiquarian or natural historical interest. Instead, living in the years following the Napoleonic conquest, Venice found itself faced with major financial difficulties. Hence, Chicognara had been hired to appraise the collection for possible sale, its proceeds intended to fund the renovation of San Marco. To this end, he tempers his above speculations about the nature of turquoise in general with a more practical view of this object in particular. Having to satisfy the requirement, he writes, of the order to confirm the value of this collection of monuments, removing the bowl from its precious mounting and subjecting it to every manner of zoological study, it is a work of art and labor of smelting. However, it does not cease to be of great value, and it is enough here to bear in mind the value in which the ancients held glassmaking, and to read what classical authorities and modern writers have published in relation to the Sacro in Genoa and of marine vases. Hence, even though Chicognara ultimately conceded that it was glass rather than a gemstone, he nevertheless insisted upon the bowl's monetary value, namely 4,000 lire, which made it a tie for the single most valuable piece in the collection. At the end of this passage, Chicognara makes reference to another large simulation gemstone, the emerald-colored Sacro Catino. This piece has a parallel, perhaps sadder fate, which we might trace at length if not for want of time. In short, the object, according to recent laboratory analysis, was likely made in Mesopotamia during the Parthian or Sasanian period. It was later taken as crusader booty in Caesarea in 1101, and upon arriving in Europe, was said to be of true emerald. Following the French conquest of Italy, the Sacro Catino was removed from Genoa to Paris for analysis by a whole panel of scientists. In the course of being returned to Italy, it was accidentally broken, by which point it was decided that the object was, without a doubt, glass. What makes these studies remarkable is not their triumph of some scientific method, but rather the period in which they happened to occur. Opaque turquoise glass had essentially ceased to be produced in Venice in the early 17th century, notwithstanding a handful of extant examples from a shipwreck in Croatia. Given the taste for cristallo, the color mostly disappeared from European glass factories until the French opaline craze in the early 19th century. That is to say, the moment when Chicognara was himself writing. This might make us wonder if it was not the advent of colored glass, but rather its disappearance that led to confusion over both materials. More to the point, recognition of the San Marco bowl's material was not based on disauthentication as a gemstone, but rather recognition of the object's properties as glass. A few years after Chicognara, Francesco Zanotto published his own account in which he inspects the quality of its workmanship. We, emboldened by recent observations by the now late Marcantonio Corniani, he writes, come to the conclusion that this cannot be true turquoise stone, but rather a mixture of marine glass, evidenced by its sound, the bubbles that can be seen in raking light, certainly caused by the smelting, and the form and gloss which allow one to see chipped fragments around the lip underneath the gold mounting. Curiously, early modern scholars like Chicognara and Zanotto, who believed the bowl to be glass, never went on to say that the work was deceptive. Instead, it was simply a work of art. This history reaches a tense climax in the work of a final writer whom I will mention, Antonio Pessini. Not much can be said about this author's biography, except that he, like Stringer before him, was a canon at the cathedral. His remarks on the San Marco turquoise fill a number of pages, where he takes umbrage to his contemporaries' critique of what he saw as long-standing tradition. Until the second quarter of the present century, things went smoothly for this bowl, he writes, and no one, at least publicly, doubted that it was in substance an Oriental turquoise. In the second quarter of this century, some people ranted, waving around their learning to say that it was nothing other than an artificial stone, paste, in a word, manufactured glass or pottery. He then has a whole page where he goes on to speak about Uzun Hasan and quote-unquote barbarian ethics, which I'm skipping over. Now I ask, is it not repugnant to the sense of barbarian pride that a vessel of mere paste, of little to no value, should be so richly and gracefully adorned and encrusted with gems? And what is more, since the ambassadorship of Uzun Hasan was specifically aimed at forging alliance between Persia and Venice to fight from front and rear by land and sea the common enemy, the Turk, wouldn't it have been a gaffe to take the queen of the Adriatic for a fool, and rather than counting her as an ally, or at least a source of aid, make her into an enemy, sending her a princely gift of such a bagatelle? This description is replete with a number of prior assumptions, whether essentialist, prideful, or both. And once again, this could lead us down a number of alleys. One of his arguments, for example, was that Persia had not made glass at the time of Uzun Hasan, that the craft had only been introduced in the 17th century. This is actually a claim that is still falsely repeated by art historians today, who cite in evidence 3 17th century European travelers who wrote in their later books of a Venetian poor and avaricious who taught in Shiraz for a few crowns. In reality, a number of mostly unpublished Persian language sources attest to the use of glass at this time in both Isfahan and Kashan. However, in the end, Basini is not really making an appeal to such historical knowledge. Instead, having posed a series of rhetorical questions about barbarian pride and the like, he turns to a domain that he believes will offer true vindication of his position about the San Marco bowl, experimental science. He proceeds to dismiss prior inquiries in this direction, like that of Zanotto, and to the likely horror of modern conservators, he undertook a destructive test. I wanted to try the action of hydrochloric acid, an acid that in no way attacks glass, whereas it dissolves true turquoise. And proceeding with the utmost caution, I had a favorable and satisfactory result. And because of this positive test, and for reasons already mentioned, I refrained from testing further the turquoise's genuineness, whether by dissolving it in the above-mentioned acid in a closed container to know if it would decay in the solution, nor by subjecting it to heat drawn into the test tube to vet the results, nor by any other chemical means. This article is truly too long, but still I beg your pardon to go on just a bit more. It was not some silly urge to make people believe that the treasury of San Marco was ennobled by yet another vessel of the highest value, which prompted me to save the Persian bowl from calumny, but the unadulterated and honest truth, which I've always maintained in my work. Having applied acid to the precious object, it seems that this ate away a part of the surface. This may be responsible for some of the pitting that we see today in photographs. Success for Basini, this dissolution of the object was success for Basini in showing that the object was indeed turquoise. It is perhaps because he saw the treasury as having many vessels of the highest value that he was willing to risk damage and sacrifice one of them to prove his point, the object of one's study perhaps being more disposable than one's pride. Unbeknownst to Basini, he was again working under a set of false assumptions. It is true that hydrochloric acid does not act upon glasses, so long as they're of the most common soda-lime silica composition. It does, however, dissolve lead silica glasses in particular. Hence, the San Marco turquoise in particular, which contains over 40% lead oxide, was just as susceptible to damage as the stone that Basini mistook it for. Basini's favorable results did not show that it was turquoise, only that he was working under scientifically limited premises. And while I would love to say that he was a reactionary, someone quickly forgotten, Basini instead reopened Pandora's box, and writers would continue to claim from his day until the 1920s that the bowl, despite some claims to the contrary, was truly a gemstone. And it was not until the publication of C.J. Lamb that this myth was finally put to rest, at least among scholars. Although I have spoken here very, very briefly about what people have said regarding the San Marco turquoise, the reality is that it was never really a scholarly subject in and of itself. String and Basini were interested instead in the Cathedral of San Marco and its glory. Chicognara was interested in the treasury's contents and their potential monetary value. De Montfaucon was interested in antiquities and their inscriptions, yet others were writing about Venetian diplomatic history and so on and so forth. All of this is to say that the facts about the San Marco turquoise were never quite as interesting as the hearsay about it.
First, thank you, Matthew, for this lecture and the, thinking about your talk. I was thinking about the famous Ibn Khaldun when he was writing about the economy of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Mediterranean. And he was saying that if you want to do a profit, you just have to look for a place where you can buy something which is cheap and sell it in another place where It is expensive. This is the basic of economy, he said. So with that, I think we're going to move now to Deborah, who will comment on your talk. I'm sorry that I'm speaking like that because my chat box has been blocked, but I'm trying now to open it and to get, hopefully, all the information I need. Just a moment. Yes, so Deborah Howard is a professor emerita of architectural history in the Faculty of Architecture and the History of Art, and a fellow of St. John College at the University of Cambridge. She's a graduate of Cambridge and of the Courtauld Institute of Art. Deborah taught at different universities. She taught at University College London, Edinburgh University, and at the Courtauld Institute before returning to Cambridge in 1992. She has held visiting appointment at Yale, Harvard, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Smith College, Princeton, at the University of Melbourne and Queensland. From 2005 until 2013, she led the Center for Acoustic and Musical Experiment in Renaissance Architecture in the Department of History of Art at the University of Cambridge. And she was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2010. As you all know, her principal research interest have for many, many years been the art and architecture of Venice and the Veneto, music and architecture in the Renaissance, and the relationship between Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean, which is very relevant, of course, for this talk today. She was the holder of the Leverhulme Emeritus Fellowship between 2017 and 2019 to investigate the technological invention and architecture in the Veneto in the early modern period. I think that I heard one of your lecture on the bridge, the famous Bridge Rialto of Venice at that moment. And apart from numerous scholarly articles, her monographic publication includes, again relevant for this talk, her book, which is called Venice and the East, the Impact of Islamic World on the Venetian Architecture between 1100 and 1500, which was published by Yale University Press in 2000. So with not much ado, I'm moving now to Deborah, and let Deborah now comment on the paper of Matthew. Please, Deborah.
Thank you very much. Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes, it's a great honor to do this. And thank you, Matthew, for your fascinating paper, which made me think about a lot of things. It's a wonderful topic. And I really applaud your decision in this paper to focus on a single object biography as a vehicle for charting critical approaches and changing values through time. And the turquoise glass bowl in the treasury of San Marco is an ideal example for this kind of study because its meaning and materiality are so slippery over time, as you've shown. Oh dear. Yeah. So your paper certainly made me think much harder about using material culture in making historical arguments. In my own work, I'm ashamed to say that I adopted the supposed date and origin of the work, Iran or Iraq, 9th to 10th century, without much investigation, and presumed this to be evidence of the very earliest Venetian Mediterranean trade at the time of the acquisition of the relics of San Marco in 828, 829, or soon afterwards. In retrospect, I recognize wishful thinking here, even though we know that the will of the Doge at the time, Doge Giustiniano Partecipatio, mentions his investments in trade and his possession of luxury objects. Well, as we've seen, the bowl was probably made as a conscious imitation of turquoise stone in glass, a kind of simulation, definitely not fakery or counterfeit, that has a very long history. The Great Gate of Babylon, with its revetment of blue glazed bricks, was deliberately intended to create the fiction that the processional route was covered with the costly materials of turquoise and lapis lazuli. the inscription which Nebuchadnezzar placed on the wall of the approach to the gate said, "The street for the procession I decorated magnificently with stones from the mountains, not with bricks covered with glaze." In other words, he's deliberately trying to simulate, make the viewer feel that they're looking at a wall made of lapis lazuli and turquoise. Perhaps Egyptian examples such as these encourage the glass historian. Sorry, I've missed a bit. Yes, I wanted to show you examples of glassware from ancient Egypt show that the ability to make turquoise colored glass already existed 3,500 years ago. And here are two examples. Perhaps Egyptian examples such as these encourage the glass historian Hugh Tate to assert that the San Marco glass bowl was probably Egyptian work of the first half of the 10th century AD. The style and decoration of the Kufic characters can be closely paralleled in Egyptian cut glass and rock crystal of this period. On the other hand, the turquoise color must have evoked a Persian connection in the minds of those Venetian merchants who traveled to Central Asia because of their special skill in the production of cobalt and turquoise glazed tiles and ceramics in intense glowing blues. Thus, it's surprising, it's not surprising that the link with Uzun Hasan took root, especially after the publication of the travels in Persia of Josephat Barbaro and Ambrogio Contarini in the mid-16th century. This illumination of the parade of the Persian glassblowers shows that Central Asia was still making blue glass in the later 16th century. Well, this brings me to Giovanni Stringa, mentioned by Matthew. And here I think there's a bit of confusion aroused by, perhaps by Gallo in his publication of the inventories of the treasury, because there are two different books by Stringa. There's the account of San Marco in his guide to Venice, his revised edition of Francesco Sansovino's guide to Venice in 1604. And then there's the Life of St. Mark the Evangelist, which was published in 1610. And both of them include descriptions of the church, slightly different, not the same, although a lot of what follows in the Life of St. Mark was lifted from the earlier version in the revised edition of Sansovino's guide. But what he says in the Sansovino guide in 1604 is it just mentions that the Scudellotto, this bowl, has no price, a priceless article. And then, as we've heard in the 1610 edition, he talks about the Oriolo, the watch, which was given by Uzun Hasan. Who knows what this was? I'd love to know more about that as well. And then he goes on to talk about the bowl of turquoise, una turquina, with the so-called Egyptian letters on the bottom. And we need to know really much more about why Stringa even changed his account between 1604 and 1610. A lot was happening in Venice at that time around the church to do with the interdict, but that's a complicated subject. Now, that it's very important to remember, by the way, that San Marco wasn't the cathedral at all until 1807. It was the shrine for the body of St. Mark, and it was the Palatine Chapel of the Doge. So the treasury was not a cathedral treasury. It was a set of treasuries of gifts given to the Republic, largely, that were often mounted, as Avinoam Shalem has shown us, to look like Christian objects. The most precious relics and silverware were kept in the upper floor of the sacristy, but the treasury, the gems, occupied a nearly fortified space on the north side of the basilica. And they were only shown on very, very special occasions, special feast days, or shown to extremely high prestige visitors who were allowed to go into the treasury. So of course, the difficulty of access only enhanced their supposed value. Of course, as Avinoam has said, Venetian glassmakers, as Matthew has said, Venetian glassmakers knew very well how to make turquoise glass. They knew how to simulate lots of different precious materials, and you can see their instructions how to do this in glass manuals, such as these ones here. Lots of recipes for making gemstones out of glass. So it's quite surprising that so many viewers, including Stringer, were taken in by the material, as Matthew has pointed out. Well, I was very intrigued to learn that the Englishman John Talman drew the objects in the treasury, because his drawings of the architecture and furnishings of the basilica, made in 1713 to 16, were recently discovered by Andrew Hopkins in the treasury, in the library of Westminster Abbey in London. And I asked him, when I read Matthew's paper, if he knew anything about drawings of the treasury. And he replied straight away and said that these are all, there's a huge number of them, and they're all in the Talman albums in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So, and this is one of them, in fact, on the left-hand side of the outside of the treasury. So it seems possible that there'd be some interesting research to be done here to find out what Talman actually drew in the treasury, and whether he gives any different information. I'm sorry, I wrongly understood Matthew to be saying that these drawings were done after Talman, when he's shown very clearly that they were done from those watercolor drawings that he showed us by Grisoni. Anyway, Matthew highlights the very important and valid point that each author uses the object to make a particular connection within his or her own narrative or theory, without checking the historiography of the subject. And I know, I recognize, and sort of with a horrible guilty feeling when I thought about this, that I've done exactly the same thing as the ridiculous or apparently ridiculous reference to the turquoise columns in Cordoba, because I wrote in an article citing an old book on Dalmatia that there were alabaster columns from Pola now in Istria, in both San Marco and the Salute. I've never been able to verify this statement, but I wrote it down when I first read it and thought that's interesting, and published it without thinking about it at all. So I can see how it's terribly, terribly easy to get seduced by your own narrative and read what you want into the objects you're looking at. Well, this Venetian turquoise bowl is a wonderful case study for the flexible interpretation of works of art. And I sympathize with Matthew's lament that catalogers don't read the original text, they just repeat the citations. Of course, anybody who's organized an exhibition knows that catalogs are prepared against very tight deadlines, so you just do the best you can. And the slippery nature of this glass bowl makes it an ideal focus for this sort of study, because both the mineral turquoise and its simulation in glass were highly prized. Certainly, I'm sure there can be no innuendo of fakery here, but we can be sure that the confusion surrounding the object has enhanced its mystique and rooted its interpretation in the broader narrative of history and myth. The thought of the vase being tested with hydrochloric acid is terrifying. More needs to be known about the Byzantine mount, which must have enhanced its value as well as Christianizing the object, as Avinoam has shown. And of course, photography brings its own hazards. These are all pictures taken from publications and websites, what color is the vase? And what color is turquoise? Anyway, thank you for a very, very stimulating paper, which made me think about a lot of things.
Thank you for the wonderful response.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, for your comment on Matthew's paper. And I must also add to it that Matthew is bringing us through one bowl to rethink the whole, in a critical way, the historiography of writing about art, because historiography as the field was born with the critical inquiry gaze about history, but we never put the critical gaze on us and the history of us as an art historian, writing even the history of these objects. So it's a kind of a next level of dealing with that. And sometimes I'm also asking myself if we are probably all sometimes a part of this crime, and should be look carefully into our notes and publications. I would like to open the podium here for questions. So if you have any question, if you could just put under reaction your hand raised, and I will give you the possibility to speak. Well, maybe I should start with one question, Matthew. Sometimes I have the feeling that the reading of the Bar Allah, or made by God, that you describe, has to do with the fact that they were looking at the drawing rather at the object itself. And even I, years, was not able to read this inscription because it was at the bottom. So what I read, it's actually according to a drawing that I could see of other earlier drawing of these bowls. So the drawing that you have shown, I think it was from the beginning of the 18th century.
Yeah.
Was actually already transmitting the written word Khorasan into a kind of, that it could be read as Bar Allah. I mean, the alif was going up way to fit with the lam that will come later, and the noon was almost disappearing again by the end. So I wonder if you have to say something even about the movement of history as based on drawing rather than on the object itself.
Yeah, there's probably something to be said for that. In the case of de Montfaucon and his very weird transcription, it's unclear whether he was doing that based on a drawing yet to be identified, because this was before John Tellman and company, or whether it was something that he had seen himself. For example, maybe he had been given access to the treasury and only saw it very quickly and had to remember it and then did a little transcription. But no, I agree with you that the rasm, the bare text of the inscription, can be read in any number of ways. And I think it's also worth remembering that in the 17th and 18th century, Kufic, even in the Muslim world, wasn't really used anymore. And this is not even a normal version of Kufic. So I don't think it would have been legible to just about anyone working at the time. I'm also quite curious who these quote unquote Orientals were who he showed this transcription to and who agreed with him. I think that's also kind of an interesting question, just in terms of the inscription and its knowledge and linguistic knowledge or lack thereof related to the subject.
Any other question? I'm going quickly through the whole screen from one to another. David Shara, I see, yes.
So
what about
he's
asking, when was it applied? Are the games real? There appear to be some Venetian glass rosettes. Is that correct? Or did they come from the East? Very interesting, thank you.
So this is the mounting of the bowl is the thing that I've totally neglected in the course of the past few months. It was something that I had hoped to dedicate a chunk of time to had travel been possible, because frankly, I don't know enough about European metalwork of the late Middle Ages to be able to say much. But the reigning scholarly consensus, which of course needs to be critically assessed, is that the mounting probably derives from at least a couple periods. So there's these, there are indeed these enamel rosettes, which are rather clearly Byzantine. However, the mount itself may not be Byzantine. It might have been that the object, that the bowl plus the enamel rosettes were brought together on this mounting at a later point before reaching Venice or after reaching Venice. They could have been switched around from other objects. I know we could speak sort of in parallel, for example, about another treasury object, the Grotto of the Virgin, which a recent scholar whose name I'm blanking on, there was a recent article that spoke about how there were 3 enamel medallions that were removed to be replaced on another object in the treasury. So there's kind of this fluid relationship. And regarding the gems, I think some of them might actually be paste, which is then also funny, but some of them are likely real. All of this to say, this is an interesting area of research that would probably bring us closer to its itinerary on the way to Venice, whether it was from Uzun Hasan, not from Uzun Hasan, straight from the sack of Constantinople in 1204, or from somewhere else.
Yeah. You know, I wonder if I may add to this idea of mounting. The mounting is part of accepting this object into a treasury. It's almost like giving it its logo. It's the way that a painting will get its frame before it will be presented at the Met. You cannot present at the Met a painting without a frame. So it's a kind of, what I'm trying to say, that the moment it got its mounting, maybe you stop to ask yourself, what is the material it is made of? Because as even your protagonists of the 18th century, they were also asking themselves if it was regarded from the very first as a cut glass. So why should we have this precious mounting on it? The moment you have the mounting, you stop to question the material of the bowl, maybe. Possible?
Maybe. I'm not even sure how to respond. I would agree that the mounting does something to frame your perception of the object. But in terms of what that framing is exactly is another question. It's also worth remembering that these objects seem to have been used. So the framing should in theory relate to its liturgical or other function. Like I've always wondered, like what this bowl was, like if this bowl was available 5 days a year, as I believe Stringer writes, what was it being used for on those 5 days a year? Was it just being presented? Was it holding like a consecrated host? So yeah, the framing is both for the material, but also maybe to an extent for the function that it serves.
Couldn't you see it as a kind of appropriation, you know, of the gift, making it Venetian or making it sort of Christian, as suggested?
Yeah. Matthew, there are 2 other questions. One of them is, I think, very easy, and I could also answer it. There is a question that is coming from Agus. Are they any important artwork of multiculturalism or hybrid works blending Western and Middle Eastern influence? There are many, so we can move to the other ones. Thank you for your beautiful ball presentation. I'm wondering, are there any technical or radiocarbon investigation to the ball? Do you know of any trials like?
Yeah, so this occupies a whole section of a different chapter of my dissertation. First, radiocarbon dating is useful for organic materials, but not so much for inorganic ones like glass. But there's been back in 1999 to 2000, that era, right before an exhibition called Glass of the Sultans, which was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Corning Museum of Glass, and the Venetian in Athens. Robert Brill took a very tiny sample and analyzed it and was able to determine the relative proportion of the 11 major oxides. So that's how we know, for example, that it consists of 42% lead oxide. And then it's actually on the basis of a more recent study by Nadine Schiebel and others in 2018 on the glass of Samara, which was analyzed by LAICP-MS, which is a much more sensitive technical method. It's on the basis of that assemblage of glasses that I'm able to link this object to Iraq in the 9th century, and then kind of by sifting through different types of metrics, the ratio of this oxide to that oxide, you can determine different things like where the sand was from and whatnot. So yes, there have been technical investigations of the bowl, but it has to be linked to other data sets to be meaningful.
And we can maybe finish with the raised hand if the person will make himself also visible. I see something coming from Fuad Firat. If you can unmute yourself and you can ask a question, please.
Hi. I should begin with the saying that I'm not an art historian, nor am I a historian. What I was interested in is, across history, how have artistic value and economic value interacted with each other, and how do they influence each other? Perceptions about economic value versus perceptions regarding artistic value.
Yeah, so for me, this is one of the most fascinating questions about art history, but I feel like it's not particularly fashionable to speak about. We're a little bit embarrassed when we speak about the value of art. So I'm not sure I have a distilled trans-historical description of this, but just to bring one example that we've already spoken about, I think Cinquegnara gives a good example of an art historian who's also able to look at the works from an economic perspective. This whole incident kind of reminds me of the Detroit bankruptcy situation, of the sad situation where Christie's came in and had to produce this report assessing the collection, which was actually fascinating reading for the brief moment that it was publicly available. But yeah, I think there are changing values of how we relate these two things.
So I think by that we can close the question and answer to Matthew. I'm going to give it back to Holger to have the closing words, but I want to thank Deborah, Matthew, and the Sabanci Center for organizing it. And back to you, Holger, please.
Thank you very much, Avinoam. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Deborah, for a very stimulating talk that crosses the boundaries of 2 continents and several countries. Avinoam from Rome, Matthew from Paris, Deborah from Cambridge, and I myself in New York. So it is a truly multi-country effort that we went through. And of course, our participants are coming from many different countries and are joining us for our events. Matthew, this was a wonderful end to our academic year program. Matthew is a doctoral fellow at the Sarcopsabanja Center this year. We have 2 doctoral fellows and 1 postdoctoral fellows. We also give summer fellowships to our graduate students to pursue their research abroad. While that might not be possible again this summer, we hope that students will be able to travel very soon, and that you, Matthew, will be able to pick up your research again on site and see those objects that you have not been able to see. If you are interested in joining us at a future event, please do go to our website at the Sarcopsabanja Center here at Columbia University, or follow us on Twitter. But for now, I thank you all for joining today's event. Thank you to Avinoam as the moderator of the event. Thank you, Deborah, for your comments and sharing your expertise on the treasury of San Marco and on Venice and the East. And Matthew, finally, thank you for making this bowl and its biography, the phases of its life, accessible to us. So thank you so much. And I wish you all a good summer, and that we see each other again at a future event here at the Sarcopsabanja Center. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.